to the latest episode of Enterprising Minds podcast. Again, we're back with 3 topics. I'm going to follow up on our last show on average marketing and a lot of the feedback we've been getting. Alex, what'd you bring?
Going to talk a little bit about the transition basically from agencies to big orgs to small orgs, and kind of back and forth, and how that kind of changes what you do on a day-to-day basis and what the demands are. Ruthi?
And I want to talk about keywords and if they're still relevant.
Question. All right, Dave, kick us off.
Perfect. Yeah. So I just wanted to say from the get-go, thank you to everybody who has reached out after our last show on the age of average and whether or not that applies to marketing. I've had a lot of friends either reach out to me via email or text with saying I have some thoughts, or our conversation sparked enough enough things in me that I ended up writing another 1,200 word blog post following up on that. And it was a really nice change to have some really nice, thoughtful comments on big ideas and having good dialogue on it. So that was that's a nice change from an average interaction online. So wanted to say thank you to everybody for doing that. We welcome any feedback on the topics. If you have any follow-up ideas, or again, like we said, we're playing around with the ideas. So if you know of any research we should look at, or, episode ideas or anything like that, you should let us know. Get in touch. I'm going to set up an email account, so be on the lookout for that. So it'll be easier for you guys to get in touch with us. But then along with that, it's funny because, we talk about these ideas and you're kind of sitting and mulling on them, mulling them over. And then you start seeing them in the world, right? Like you go to buy a car and all of a sudden you see that particular car everywhere. So I think I'm going to, talk a little anecdote. I woke up the other day, and I think any working parent can sympathize with this. My kid was refusing to go to school, just shouting, I don't want to. Meanwhile, I have an earbud in, holding my work iPad while I'm trying to listen in on a meeting and get him out the door. And I found my dog was laying in a pile of his own throw up. So I ended up having to go to the emergency vet. So, we talk about customer experience and brand experience, both on and offline. And I'm sitting in the waiting room after checking my dog in. And off on the side is Bob Ross painting, doing things just to be like, okay, you know what? That's actually a really nice touch, right? I mean, it's a stressful situation. You're worried about your animal. And here's this really calming thing. But then after watching about 10 or 15 minutes of it, I immediately thought of our conversation on the age of average and the painting section of that, where we talk about how everybody loves landscapes. And what is Bob Ross painting? Fucking landscapes. Like, so here I am surrounded by all of the things that we talked about. And yeah, so I thought that was funny. And it, again, just kept me kind of thinking along these lines of, where you can be innovative and where you are kind of dragged back to the average, right? And I think one idea that I'm mulling around on that is the fact that, to Ruthi's point in that episode, again, if you haven't checked this out, this is a lot of thoughts building on each other. So go back to episode 4, listen to that discussion, and then come back to this section. Okay, so Ruthi, to your point of commercializing like new products and introducing things, you can be more creative on that front end. But then, in the words of Clayton Christensen, who has that jobs to be done idea, he also has this great discussion on the fact that the things that allow companies to be successful and run successfully are inevitably the things that kill it. And that is good management, right? Because the creativity is kind of more chaos, right? You want more reproducible results. So you start putting these guardrails around it, more so of like, hey, we want to optimize this so that we can get 5% over a long term and feel more steady in the growth, rather than these, really creative bursts that could be a really, really strong campaign, but then they die off really quickly. Right. So that's kind of the new lens that I'm using to think about these ideas, because it is that kind of management piece and that de-risking that I think leads to that thing that we end up calling the average marketing.
I want to play off that because it ties in very nicely with, I pitched it last time, Greg Hoffman's Emotion by Design book. It's fantastic. Right. And one of the standout comments from him in this book is the purpose of risk taking in marketing is really about creating completely new ways of engaging with customers on a level that no one else is doing, which then does two things. One, it serves almost as a game changer, and it opens up new opportunities for engaging with those customers that potentially could lead to new revenue streams. But it's that risk taking and the understanding that risk taking is doing something more than just selling product. It's creating different relationships with your customers, and that's different than optimization.
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting point there, Dave, especially about the kind of beginning, middle, end kind of aspect of creativity die off. But I keep mulling over in my head Red Bull and Red Bull's Flugtag, their ice skating racing thing that used to always come to Minnesota.
Crashed ice.
Yeah. I mean, those were some really unusual events. And then they had, I can't remember the guy's name, Bob Gardner, who fell from basically, did diving from space almost all the way down to the ground and, setting records and sort of thing like that, which worked more in a kind of COVID era where you couldn't really do big events, with tons of crowds. But their mentality definitely seems to be that maybe there are guardrails. And if you look at any of their events and their logos and design stuff, yeah, there's a lot of guardrails and brand standards going on. There isn't a variety of Red Bull logos. There's one. But their creative standard or their brand standard is to be creative and to create these unusual events that are, social media worthy talking points, kind of unusual events, build a random potential, flying object and throw it off the top of a ramp in the middle of a lake and see if it crashes or not. And that's still success no matter what happens related to it. That's a mentality that they've basically been able to maintain. And that's a variety of different events, a variety of different actions. And they've still been able to maintain that this is the Red Bull brand. Right. And there's some element to all of those pieces, which I really can't even name it. That is this extreme of normality kind of event. It's not skydiving, it's skydiving from space. It's not, ice skating, it's ice skating down a ramp with obstacles. It's always some level beyond normal is kind of their thing, but they're able to maintain it, even though those are very unusual and very different events. You think of like a company like Ford or any of like the car commercials. Yeah, I'm right there with you of the average is in, the average is all over the place.
And playing off that, Alex, and tying it back to what Dave was talking about, and this sort of idea of good management isn't necessarily, well, maybe it is, but good management traditionally maybe isn't in favor of such crazy risk taking. If we think about what's the ROI of somebody jumping out of a plane from space, and what's amazing about some of these organizations is that they're able to pull those off and cultivate the teams and cultivate the culture that enables those things to happen, to have deeper brand engagement and to do things differently. And the trick is, how do you create that sort of environment to begin with, and how do you keep it going?
Well, I think the key thing that we're dancing around here is brand, right? You can't necessarily justify jumping out of a plane if you're looking specifically at, am I selling 20,000 extra drinks, right? But if you look at it as our brand is associated with this, that, and the other, for the accountants, it would be the intangible assets, which, yay, how to say that, what you did impacted the intangible asset value. It's an interesting play there, because it is, if you look at the brands that are doing these types of things, like the Red Bulls or like Apple, who've made a stand since 1984, basically, and have had a very similar brand feel since 84. It's almost at the get-go, you have to have that idea, right? I don't think you quote innovate into this idea, right? It has to be at the beginning. I don't know. I don't have the answers. I'm still thinking this over. Yeah. Clearly it's hitting you guys in a similar way. I can see the wheels turning.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I'm trying to think of examples. Maybe this is something I'd love to hear from a larger group of people. Are there examples of brands that have innovated into this, that have started in a very different spot than what we think of traditionally, with the Apples and the Nikes coming out from nowhere? And I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Yeah. I mean, there's the piece of it that's branding. There's the piece of it that's also kind of internal culture and management. I think of that as well, of being directly aligned to that. Do you have diversity of thought within your company? Well, look at your teams. Did everybody come from the same places? Or do you actually have a diverse team? Or does everybody have pretty similar shared experiences? Right. And if they are all similar shared experiences, maybe you should shake it up. Maybe that's an outside agency helping to pitch some radically different ideas and trying to be open-minded enough not to shoot them down because it's too far out of norm, but trying to actually be creative and have that basically managerial leeway to be creative. And I think that's one of the difficulties we get into, is nobody wants to shake up the numbers enough that they might go down. So you take really, really safe bets over and over and over again, because that's the easy thing to do. And it's the stable thing to do, which, you're going to keep your job basically. So that's hard to put a stake out there and say, this is the new direction we're going to go, and try it. And I mean, there's a lot of big marketing campaigns and ad campaigns out there that have completely failed. Mm-hmm. And they tried to shift things up, go a different direction, and they went in the wrong direction based on market response at that time. Might be different nowadays from what they did, but at the time it didn't work.
Timing is an important thing that you can't really take into account.
Yeah, and understanding, I mean, there is the base marketing aspect of understanding your audience. Of Red Bull understands their audience well enough of, this is a normal-ish person who is looking for more than just coffee. Are they all the way out there into some extreme element? No, they've pulled back from that, and they're kind of a more moderate, more socially acceptable, middle range kind of energy drink. There are those out there that definitely push this, you're living on the edge of life, this is the drink for you sort of thing. That's not Red Bull at all, and it hasn't been. So they've been able to basically play into this and create this kind of safe space middle ground that is away from like the early 2000s, 2010 kind of era of energy drink ads, which is extreme sports. Mm-hmm. And there was no E, just started with an X, extreme sports. I mean, it was everything, every event possible. And there was every energy drink possible tied to that. So they found a good middle safe area that is their brand. and they're still allowed to have enough leeway to do some interesting and unusual things. I don't know. I got to imagine, though, that that's a culture thing, or else they would just do the same event every year for 10 years and eventually realize that, yep, it's been dying off. Maybe we should finally kill it off. That would be the other option. But I got to imagine there's a culture there that says, no, this is us. We got to keep doing new things. And that's a part of us, or who we are, is doing new things.
I think that's huge. And I think back to a previous organization that I worked at in the past that had sort of two different marketing teams working on different projects with very different cultures. One more the sort of traditional, we make brochures, we go to events, just sort of playing it safe, I'll call it. And then the other that was sort of doing more new out there things. And it was always a clash. And they saw the way of looking at the world completely different ways. And so when a new idea came up, depending on which team it was, there weren't necessarily the fast followers. And it's the fast followers in the culture who said, yeah, that's excellent. Let's try it. And let's be okay if we fail. Because if we're not failing, we're not pushing the boundaries. Which reminds me of just another anecdote. I guess Steve Jobs at Apple, the first time around, wanted the PepsiCo CEO to come in and take over Apple, because PepsiCo at the time had if you're not failing, you're not innovating enough sort of mentality. And that's what you need to have. And it's really hard to have that. It's hard to sell it, and you have to have the culture to support it, because people have to be comfortable to say, yeah, we're going to try something crazy and we might fall flat on our face.
Yeah, it's okay to put a whole bunch of company money behind it.
Yeah. To really go big. Or at the very least, like, put a little bit so that, you can make a big impact even with a small budget. Like, that is possible too, but you still have to be all in. Culturally, emotionally.
There's an interesting point too. Speaking of, Dave, to the transition piece, I'm still kind of playing around with that in my head, because when I switched organizations, I did a bunch of interviews with companies that weirdly had the same story. And it became, I don't know, kind of strange to me, but I realized that there was a definite pattern there. Where basically it was product-led marketing, that there was no CMO at this company, and they reached 100 employees, or about $100 million in revenue. They hit this point, and then they stagnated. And the growth aspect of the founder, CEO, you name it, either was on his way out, or recognizing that they needed some kind of fresh ideas, new ideas. So they would bring in a CMO. And then within 6 to 9 months, it was always the same date range. They decided they needed to bring in, somebody who was going to be the head of digital marketing. And that was the roles that I was interviewing for. And it was the same story over and over again. So there was this initial growth, basically based off of just a good market fit product. Right. And whoever the internal sales network, personal networks, you name it, however connections, experience, industry experience, whatever it was that enabled those sales. They got to a certain level, and then they stopped. And everybody kind of apparently stopped out around the same level. And then they wanted that switch. They wanted that change. And in some cases, it sounds like basically the C-suite got wiped out, and they started rebuilding from scratch from a top-down management standpoint. Like, that was a pretty common story too, that the initial team, the initial leaders, wasn't a good fit for this next stage. So maybe that is going to be a new safe stage, because they don't want, they were experiencing some loss, some stability, but some loss. So they needed something new.
Right. Because as soon as you have investors, there's an expectation on returns, because you've signed a contract for the investment.
Yeah. And then, there's also pain creates change. That's the other piece of it. Like, it's hard when things are really easy and good, and you're growing at a steady but not great, but steady rate, to say, yep, this is the time for change.
Right. If you've reached that 100 million mark, you taking risks, all of a sudden you have a lot more to lose than when you were at half that or a quarter of that.
Right.
And now you've got all of your people that you want to make sure, are good, happy, working. it's harder to take those risks.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of transitioning between things, Alex, why don't you jump into your big org, small org experience?
Yeah, it's a little bit of my own career experience of going from agencies to in-house, back to agencies, freelancing, back and forth basically through that. Currently at an agency, used to be at an enterprise org, you name it. So I was just realizing and some of the significant differences between those size of organizations, as well as what's expected from an SEO standpoint. So we can throw in a little SEO in this episode. So toss that in there. And one piece with the big org, when you have tons of teams, every role is split, it seems, into 5 different people's roles. So now you have to get 5 people's buy-in versus, the one person who is maybe in charge of web development.
Right.
So things become a little bit more difficult, and definitely the soft skills become a bigger emphasis. You prove with the technical skills that you have some idea of what you're talking about, and it's heavy on the soft skills to get the project done. Agency world, it's far smaller organizations. Typically, there are large agencies out there. I've never worked for one that's like 100, 200 person size company. I've never done something like that. Mine have always been 100 or less, 50 or less kind of size. But with those organizations, you don't have enough time and enough people to do everything. So if you have an idea, just go do it and move on and keep moving on and keep doing the next thing. And we're going to keep pushing and keep doing stuff, because you're working with a ton of different clients who end up being a bunch of different bosses. And with anything SEO wise, it takes time. It takes a lot of research. And eventually you get to a point of like, this is the idea, we should do it. No one has enough time to say no to it, or enough time to say, well, let's question this. Let's talk about this. Let's meet next week again and talk about it again. Instead, it's sure. Yeah, sounds good. Let's get it done. And then a few hours later, it's done. What's next? And then suddenly as an SEO, I was like, what's next? I was expecting a whole bunch of no's. I was expecting at least a week. And you got it done the same afternoon. So guess I need new ideas. So the speed of implementation changes, and you get very much into a tactical mindset, and it's hard to step back a little bit and get back in the strategic mindset, which is the other thing I found is everybody gets so tactical that, it's taking some emails, some meetings to get people to step back a little bit, look at a current, project, something that's already been live, and say, can we do better? Is this a good strategy? Comparison to competitors. Are we, positioned correctly? Are there elements that we should change and update? Conversion rate optimization elements, UX elements, you name it.
Right.
So that's been one significant shift between the two. I don't know. I was curious from the two of you and your experiences from small organizations to large organizations, and the differences from a job day-to-day demand standpoint. Have you noticed that kind of shift, that, it used to be more of a fast reaction speed, and now it's much more of a slow, long-term strategic speed? Or have you seen some pockets where there's been some changes?
So when I was in the agency side, at least, in listening to your descriptions and your setups, the best projects that I did work on were when we had the postmortems, like with the agile methodologies, right? What made this successful? Why did this work? Or, conversely, why did this fall flat on its face? Why, was it our execution? Was it the speed with which the client would get back to us, right? Project managing agency stuff for sure is the like, hey client, we do want to do this, but it's taken you 6 days to get back to us, which, I've been on both sides of that equation, so I have sympathy for both sides. But when you're trying to do good things and try to do good work, it can be frustrating with that, speed differential. Your point about soft skills does hit me, because there is a lot more politicking, at least in my experience. And it's only compounded when you get up to the global level too,
You're
right?
saying in a large org, that's the
In
case.
a large org, yeah. Because it's not just convincing one boss, it's convincing, bosses in multiple regions or countries or whatever else. And it's all fine, it's all good. And everybody, the thing that I had to learn ultimately was that everybody is coming from a good place, fundamentally. And I'm still working on that. But that ultimately does affect the speed, I think. There are benefits to both, but when I first joined the large org, my big especially in the SEO type role, I had a realization one day where I was like, okay, the search engines trust this organization enough that we can do basically whatever we want and we won't be dinged. Because on the agency side, when you're talking about those services, it really is get them to trust you, like build up the domain authority, whether or not that's a valid metric. We're not talking about that today. But find all of the different signals that will impact your ranking ability, right? Like that was really kind of at the heart of it. But yeah, there's enough room to screw up, which allows you to be slower and allows you to do things that may not be best practice. But again, everybody's coming from a good place, I think. I hope.
Such growth, Dave.
I know. It's possible.
It's great.
The more you know.
Here's what I've been thinking about a lot. Great teams have a few attributes about them, or the inputs to great teams, I would say, have a few attributes. One is that they're autonomous. They're able to, given a set of objectives, figure out the best way to do it. Two is that they have the necessary skills within the team. So the dependencies are limited. Not none, just limited. And three is that there's a strong sense of purpose in what you're doing. And what occurs to me is that in smaller organizations, it's much easier to end up with those environments simply because you don't have a lot of people. So by necessity, people kind of have to do everything and they have to be autonomous because you just don't have the layers. And oftentimes with smaller organizations, they're doing fewer things, which means that the sense of purpose just naturally might be tighter, simply because there's not as many potential purposes that could be competing with each other. Whereas as you have a larger organization, the autonomy goes down as you have more people who potentially get more specialized. The necessary skills, again, with the more specialization goes away. The autonomy too, if you get layers of middle management, for example, all of a sudden you have layers of complexity there. And the sense of purpose becomes fuzzier because there's so many different purposes you could be going towards. And unless you have somebody with a very tight vision and sort of leading the way, it's hard to get. And so I think that's the biggest shift is in an enterprise or a larger organization, you're less likely to have those naturally occurring within teams as you do within a smaller. And it's not to say none. And so the shift is, or the going from a small organization to a large organization, it's more about making sure you maintain those three parts of the stool of having a great team or finding a team that already has those if you're doing it. So that's, I think, for me, the biggest difference between the two. And one thing related to that I do tell, any interns that we work with is go find a small organization because you're going to be able to get your hands in more things than if you're at a very large organization where, you might get to do one part of one process of one capability and that's all you get exposed to. So I think that's true across organizations, whether you're agency or client side. Is just what are the circumstances within which the teams are playing, and what's elevating them to be successful.
There's a point there that I think we've talked a little bit about, even with Dave, your first topic of ownership. That's the piece that I keep coming back to in different ways. I mean, there's some different facets to it, basically. From one, it's the small business owner who has the feeling of ownership to be able to risk it all, which says, right, yes, we'll do some crazy creative thing that may work or fail. And, I've got 5 people with me and we're all just as crazy with this idea of a startup, which we all know might fail. So we're accepting of that risk and we're tolerant of that risk to such a degree that, they feel they have the ownership to make that decision. And when they hit the 100-person, that large size company, they start to lose that feeling that they can risk it all, because now people's, pensions are in effect, and people's, plans of growing their families based upon them still having a job and being able to buy a house and all the rest of those elements. So that changes. The other piece that I keep thinking about is from an agency standpoint, you are always on the side of you're in service to your client, and the client has the ability to basically fire you at will. And within a large organization, that doesn't exist. So there isn't.
Because by the time you're up for firing, your boss has probably forgotten about your crap project in Q1 anyway.
Well, I think the difference is in a big organization, you still have internal customers or clients. You still have stakeholders, but they can't fire you as easily. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, and they don't have basically there isn't as clear ownership lines over anything, basically. Like, you want to make a change to the website. Does the web developer own the website? Does the business, person who has something with the product that happens to be on that web page, do they own it? Who gets to quote unquote own it? And then who also is quote unquote, fireable, tied to the performance of that? And the answer seems to be nobody, or nobody knows. I mean, and that just kind of weakens the impetus of every meeting, the, excitement or risk taking or desire to get anything done. I mean, it changes so much when you remove those elements of my performance, my personal career is tied to X, and that's it. Like,
through ownership comes accountability.
Yeah.
So I don't think that those, like, you have to have one to have the other. One of my favorite books that I've read in the last year was, Principles by Ray Dalio. And if you're not familiar, he founded BlackRock Consulting. No. Bridgewater Associates. There we go. Not BlackRock, Bridgewater. But this book is awesome. And he's basically made a bunch of YouTube videos and all this stuff free. He was the one with the idea of the radical transparency. And, you talk about a culture that is, very specific to a certain type of person, that you have to be comfortable getting any kind of feedback at any point based on, the organization and how they're doing. But at the absolute center of that is ownership and being held accountable for whatever happens to that. And it doesn't matter if, the idea came from the most junior person or the CEO. It doesn't matter who it's best idea. He's trying to go towards what he calls an idea meritocracy. And this, from a pure theoretical standpoint, I think I would love that. But it won't work for the big organizations that, again, like the creativity, like the Red Bull stuff, were founded with that idea, right? Because you have that big leader, like, Ray, who instituted that and built teams around that and set up processes around it to weed out the people who didn't really like that, setup. Right. Yeah.
Addendum, it won't work overnight, and it won't work with without big change.
Correct.
You don't get there with the status quo.
No. I'm going to go on a limb and say that it's too big of a change for incumbent cultures. And I'm happy to receive pushback on that. But I did have two other points to get to Alex's thing. Between agencies and enterprises or larger companies or mom and pop versus public or whatever, however you want to slice it. I do think, Ruthi, to your point with the interns, I think starting your career at the agency side is wonderful and is definitely some way to go. Not just because you have the time to have like the crazy agency lifestyle, because you don't have kids or mortgages or nightlifes or whatever else, but you get to be exposed to a plethora of go-to-market models, industry types, client types, the different personalities of the client, so that you can kind of suss out, like, I fit within these cultures I'm intrigued by these particular types of industries. And I have no desire to work with these other ones. Right. So you can weed out all of that and really kind of hone in on where you want to focus, because through that specialization is where you will build your career. Right. And you also have to play with the market dynamics, right? We're not set up with that. The switch between agency and in-house, I think, is just going to be cyclical, because, as soon as companies want to cut costs, what do? They kill Marcom. And then everybody goes to the agency side. And then over time, the accountants again are like, hey, why are we paying so much? We should just bring these people in-house. And then everybody goes back in-house, and then you're there for a time, and then, you get cut again. And that just happens over and over and over again. So being able to read those tea leaves will set up your career pretty well, too.
All right, I'm lobbing the final question.
Cool.
What is the role of the keyword in SEO today?
I was going to take a stab at that. I would say, specific, basically what Google used to have is exact match. The keyword doesn't really exist anymore. The entity, the idea of that keyword is what exists today. Kind of a ridiculous story, but way back when, so a dozen years ago or so, looking at SEO for basically a furniture company, we're looking at brown chair versus brown chairs. We were thinking about two different pages because we wanted to go after brown chair and we wanted to rank for brown chairs. And at that time, it was exact match. It mattered. Now you type in brown chair and you're probably going to end up with IKEA because they're furniture related, and that has more to do with the entity that basically is a chair versus the exact match keyword that is a brown chair. This exact match domain names, used to be a thing. That was a kind of, for the most part, died off. So you don't really have to own, brownchairs.com anymore. You can just own whatever, Ruthi.com, and have a furniture store on it, and they'll be fine. Those have changed so drastically that, we're after that entity now versus anything else. And to be honest, I think that was always probably the smart play anyways, was basically going after everything that was related to that and, covering off on those topics, becoming the best resource on Google for that particular topic. That would have set you up well today, but it also would have got you a bunch of other related search phrases that you weren't necessarily going after, but your content's about it. So you're probably going to get that kind of traffic. So your overall kind of organic traffic levels would be supported by people at least close to the right market versus, one term, one page, and then moving on from there. I guess that's my stance. I can go a whole bunch into like vectors and how NLP works, but I guess you can stay away from that for the moment.
I largely agree. You do the best with what you have when you have it, right? So like at the time, the brown chairs, to your example, you had to. Now, in thinking about it, the only time it would be appropriate to maybe target a single chair would be like, a Facebook ad for the recently divorced, because you don't need to, right? You only need.
Wah,
wah. Privacy concerns aside, yeah. How sad is that? You have a brown chair.
Yes.
Nothing.
just the one.
Should be gray chair.
Yeah, I don't know. I think or at least where my head is now, and has kind of always been, even when you would target specific terms like that, it is always been the psychological forces behind what they're trying to do. I think that's why in all of our discussions, the conversations around behavioral economics is really fascinating to me, or even like, persuasion. Guys like Robert Cialdini are really interesting to me because it goes to the decision making of the consumer. How and why are they making these decisions? What are they trying to do when they are executing that search? Yeah, and then you build the experience around that. I think I'm of the belief that the fundamentals don't change. The tools and the way in which you do that, they change all the time, right? Like organic social used to be a thing. Now, forget it. That's a pay to play for sure. Like, yeah. But if you were to develop an audience, find the audience, and work that audience, it may make sense. I think an example to showcase where I'm going, and maybe not well, but this is at least where I'm going, was when Rand Fishkin was talking to Will Reynolds, and one of the things you shared, Alex, the fireside chat, he brought up the idea that when he started SparkToro, he and his colleague literally could not find any key terms to, target, because nobody is targeting, or nobody is searching for a tool that finds where their audience is hanging out and speaking to each other online, right? That just doesn't exist. So how does that change the way you market? You can't do SEO. You have to do the content and the outreach to where the audience is, right? So that's why he's been on every single podcast, every single webinar for the last 3 years, because he's trying to reach these audiences, convince them with the ideas, showcase the product in different use cases, and they're doing great. I think a lot of us with SEO backgrounds can convince ourselves that SEO has to be involved all the time. No, sometimes it's not the way.
Thinking about your comment about the fundamentals too, I always go back to that. I'm highly skeptical about keywords in our current technological situation. Right? We have Google is quite advanced. It's quite good at knowing what people are looking for. Mm-hmm. Not perfect. And now we have large language models, which are starting to answer questions as well. And so it just seems more and more that are you providing answers to the things your customers are looking for? Are you adding value to what they're trying to do on your website, with your social channels? And if you're solving for that, you're probably going to be okay. And it could be that keywords are helpful in the sense of understanding what people are searching for, how they're phrasing their questions, how they're asking their questions, and then responding to what they're looking for, less so about responding to the specific words that are being typed into a search box.
Yeah, and how the behavior around search is also changing. I think a product probably before, but like the idea of walking up to a human being and someone on the street and saying restaurants near me, it's bizarre. You don't do that, but you type that into a search engine. But if you're doing voice search, you probably are saying something that's a lot longer. If you're using an assistant like Siri, you're probably saying something far longer. I mean, that changes too. If you're asking ChatGPT, it's far longer than that. So how we're searching is becoming more human, to be honest, and becoming more natural. From the keyword standpoint, there is, like we look at large language models, search engines, all the rest, they're all still basically playing upon keywords. They're changing how they understand them, and they're becoming more complex and, again, just more human about how they understand things. But the terms are still basically there. I mean, maybe you search brown chairs and you get IKEA because you're looking for furniture, and they kind of understand that you're looking for furniture overall and probably want more selection. Or the one I always like to use is like I am going to nerd out. Sorry. We're going to get into vectors. I apologize. It won't take long.
Go for it, Alex.
Own the nerdiness.
But it's a good way to understand like large language models, search engines, and a bunch of these things, because natural language processing is the very fancy term that basically covers the field. But if I were to type in a search engine, how big is a queen? That would not be the now past Queen of England. That would not be Freddie Mercury from the band Queen. That would be probably a queen-size bed. How tall is Queen? That might be Freddie Mercury's height. How tall was the Queen? That's the Queen of England. So you've got the phrase queen, which now is close to the entity, the idea of music bands, Queen. You've got the idea of royalty, Queen of England, and you've got the idea of sizes of beds and furniture. We're still somehow hitting furniture with this example. So now you have the phrase queen. If I were just to search queen, that is somewhere in the intersection of at least three little bubbles of music, royalty, and furniture. And when I start to add little helper words around that, it kind of pushes me in one direction or another direction. And that is a lot of things. If you were to try to plot that onto a piece of paper and you had three bubbles and you try to plot this in the middle of it, it gets pretty complex, because I'm sure there's probably maybe 10 other things I'm not thinking about. So really it's 3D instead. Think of a 3D space. If I were to plot that, I'm going to put at least three numbers, up, down, left, right. You're going to have three numbers to basically say this is the coordinate of where the word queen lives, because it lives here in between these bubbles that are these other ones, and those live at these coordinates. So now what you've done effectively is you've taken all of language and you turned it into math, and that's natural language processing, because you could assign that phrase a 4-number, 5-number, 6-number, whatever coordinate of math, and say it is 0.1 away from this phrase and 0.5 away from this phrase. So those are now related phrases. And that's basically, if you consider all those little points within a giant map, those are called vectors. And that's where all the entities, the ideas live. And that's where natural language processing basically works off of, is trying to understand how close is this phrase to this phrase? How different are these from these things? And then when we start to understand like how these little helper words of how, is, and big, all those other why, then it starts to push you in different directions. And that's basically.
And this is the thing that makes me sad and nervous about large language models and people's reliance on that, because it uses the standard definitions of the predominant language version, right? Because if you start talking about regional dialects, those terms will start to have very different meanings, right? Or even different spellings. And not everything, like, now granted, if we want to go into the philosophical debates, the philosophical practice of logic has always been turning language and stuff and meaning into math, so that you can do all the if then and yeah buts and alsos. But it doesn't capture everything. You know what I mean? It's an approximation.
Dave, you're such a
always.
downer.
No,
I'm ready
not.
to make a t-shirt that says plot the queens. with a little infographic on it.
You go, by all means, go do it. But I think, we have an over-reliance on data as the correct thing. And it's not. Like anything, it's an approximation. Right? And the thing that makes language so rich is not that it is 0.5, status updates of this. It is within the context of a culture and a heritage and a way of being that makes it alive, not math.
I don't think you could say the word with any much more disdain than that.
That was beautiful.
I mean, Dave, that gets perfectly into your point too about the use of keywords. I mean, they're over-reliance on keywords and keyword data. I mean, and any SEO, if you just believe what Google Keyword Planner told you, you're going in the wrong direction. The numbers are wrong. They're averaged and bucketed, and there's huge amounts of seasonality to all of them. And you're only going to get a tiny percentage of them, no matter whatever ranking position you're in. You're not going to get all that number anyway. So those numbers are false. They're maybe leading you in the right direction, but they're still false. And it's also limited. I mean, that, man, people search a heck of a lot more around this topic. I mean, they search 10, 11 word phrases, and Keyword Planner, I think, even stops you if you were trying to figure out even the volume of a 10-word phrase. It won't even give it to you. Right. So all that data is missing. I mean, there's huge gaps when we become myopically data reliant. And I think you're absolutely right in that there are severe limitations to that, which I think has helped to the rise of tools like Also Asked and the other related tools to that, where basically you're starting to query, again, still Google data, but it's people's longer questions, more in-depth questions, and the questions that follow those questions. And that informs you of the mental state and the topic and the needs and wants of the audience, which gets beyond Queen, right. 1,200 searches a day. That doesn't teach you much.
And again, like the creative writer in me, what lens are you reading things through, right? Like, what are you focusing on, right? So I think in the tech side of what it is we do, the data is nice. And oh my God, a new shiny toy. Isn't this wonderful? I can do this to convince my bosses to do more of what I do. This is great. If we were to take that focus and then turn it to any kind of global campaign that you might have worked on, what is the first thing you do? Or at least I hope, what is the first thing you do? You ask, will this be culturally okay to use this messaging in your country? And they will say yes or no. Because the difference between, saying, well, I'm not going to go super specific, but like if there are differences where, like, even within Spanish speaking countries, in one country it might be okay to say something, in the other it might be insulting your grandmother's cooking, in the same way. And you can't do that. You can't launch that because it's going to unintentionally tank your campaign. Right. But the data said it was okay because it's Spanish speakers in the world. No. Grandmas empanadas do not deserve that. Right.
Just to take us to an optimistic note before we end.
That's not optimistic. That's just...
I just want to put in a bit of a plug for how amazing it is that language as math, while it comes with some asterisks and, some watch out, is so powerful. I mean, the fact that we can find the world's information easily because of what Google and other companies have been able to do is quite phenomenal. That's all.
It is unbelievable the amount of skill and thought that has to go into even the most basic setup that we have. I'm not discounting that. I am not capable of doing anything that they have done to set up this instance, right? I fully recognize that. However, part of me wonders if we're still just at the Mad Lib stage, right? Like it feels like you're pulling a slot machine and it's like adverb, verb, pronoun. And then you have your little story. Like that is kind of how ChatGPT feels to me. Like, create a story around this, that, and the other, and, you know, say something that would insult your sister. Okay. Like, I don't know. Everybody's road trips as a kid. You can think back to
Mad Lib GPT.
Exactly. But I don't know. Again, it's just me trying to make sense of the world, and I'm dumb enough to share it publicly. So I'm owning my foibles. But it is really awesome, and it's exciting to see where it goes, even with the commentary of don't just trust tech, and don't just idolize San Fran. Luckily, I think we're stepping away from that a little bit. But just because you have a tech hub doesn't mean you believe everything that comes out of it. You know, I hope.
Full circle. Don't be a lazy marketer.
Exactly.
Use your brain.
And on that note, we're going to cancel. We're not going to cancel the show. We are going to stop this show before we're canceled. Thank you, everybody, for making it this far and listening. Please like, subscribe, and share so that we can get more people involved and more ideas involved in the discussions. More to come on how we will make it easier to get in touch with us. And we're having enough fun that we might make this more frequently. So another announcement on that. Stay tuned, and we will see you in the next episode of Enterprising Minds. Take care.
Thanks.
Cheers.